The Last Christmas in Marrickville. Chapter 1. The Last Christmas in Marrickville. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Margaret O'Connor's Federation home, casting delicate patterns across the polished floorboards that had witnessed 63 Christmases. She stood in her kitchen, flour dusting her weathered hands as she carefully folded the final touches into her pavlova, the same recipe she'd perfected over decades, the one Peter used to say could make angels weep with envy. "Another Christmas, my darling," she whispered to the empty kitchen, her voice carrying the weight of a year's worth of conversations held only with memories. The photograph on the windowsill, Peter in his RSL uniform, grinning that crooked smile that had won her heart at a Newtown dance hall in 1962, seemed to nod in understanding. Margaret had been preparing since dawn. The lambs sat seasoned and ready in the ancient Metters stove that had come with the house, its surface scarred from decades of Christmas feasts. The dining table, extended to its full length, groaned under the weight of her mother's china delicate pieces that had survived the Depression, the war, and countless family gatherings. Each plate told a story. Each cup held memories of conversations that mattered. The house itself seemed to pulse with anticipation. Every corner held echoes of Christmases past the spot by the fireplace, where Daniel had torn open his first bicycle, the doorway where Peter had lifted their grandson, Tommy, high above his head just 3 years ago, before the cancer took him. The very walls seemed to remember laughter, the clash of cutlery, the warm chaos of a family truly together. Margaret smoothed her best dress navy blue with tiny white flowers, the one Peter had bought her for their 40th anniversary. She'd saved it for special occasions. And surely Christmas with her son's family qualified. Her hands shook slightly as she fastened the pearl necklace. Another gift from Peter, and she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. When had she become so small? The woman, staring back at her, seemed diminished somehow, as if grief had physically shrunk her. Her gray hair, carefully set at the local salon just yesterday, framed a face marked by 7 decades of joy and sorrow. But her eyes still held the fierce love of a mother who had raised a son, through scraped knees and broken hearts, who had built a life and a home worth preserving. The sound of a car door slamming jolted her from her reverie. Through the front window, she watched Daniel emerge from his silver BMW, checking his watch with the impatient efficiency that had made him successful in corporate law. Behind him, Victoria stepped out with practiced grace, her designer heels clicking against the concrete path that Peter had laid stone by stone 30 years ago. Margaret's heart lifted despite herself. Her son looked distinguished in his pressed shirt and tailored trousers, every inch the successful barrister she'd raised him to become. Victoria, as always, was perfectly put together, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her cream silk blouse and black trousers. Speaking of boutiques, Margaret had only passed by, never entered. The children tumbled out of the back seat. Tommy, now 15 and all awkward limbs, and little Sophie, just turned 8, her dark curls bouncing as she skipped toward the house. Margaret's chest tightened with pure love as she opened the front door. Nana Margaret, Sophie launched herself into her grandmother's arms, and for a moment, the world was exactly as it should be. "My precious girl," Margaret murmured, breathing in the scent of Sophie's strawberry shampoo. "You've grown so tall since I saw you last." Tommy approached more cautiously, that teenage reluctance to show affection, warring with genuine fondness for his grandmother. Margaret reached out and tousled his hair, ignoring his half-hearted protest. "Daniel," she said, turning to her son with arms outstretched. He embraced her briefly, a perfunctory gesture that left her feeling like she was hugging a stranger. "Victoria, dear, you look lovely as always." Victoria's smile was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to avoid rudeness, distant enough to maintain boundaries. "Thank you, Margaret. Something smells wonderful. Just the usual Christmas spread," Margaret replied, ushering them inside. "I started the lamb early this morning. And the pavlova's been chilling since yesterday. You know how Peter always said." "Mum," Daniel interrupted, his voice carrying a note of gentle but firm correction. "Let's not start with the stories just yet. We've only just arrived." Margaret's words died in her throat. She nodded, swallowing the memory of Peter's Christmas morning tradition of sneaking tastes of pavlova before breakfast. How he'd wink at her from across the kitchen as if they were co-conspirators in the sweetest of crimes. They moved into the living room, and Margaret watched Victoria's eyes survey the space with barely concealed distaste. The room was exactly as it had been for 20 years. Peter's leather armchair, still positioned to catch the afternoon light for his reading, the bookshelf, packed with well-worn novels and local histories, the mantelpiece crowded with photographs, spanning decades of birthdays, graduations, and quiet Sunday afternoons. "The children have been so excited about today," Margaret said, settling into her chair and patting the sofa beside her for Sophie to join her. "I thought after lunch, we could look through the old photo albums. I found some wonderful pictures of your father at Tommy's age, Daniel." Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She perched on the edge of the sofa, as if preparing for a quick escape, her manicured fingers drumming against her clutch purse. "Actually, Mum," Daniel said, loosening his tie slightly, "we can't stay too long today. Victoria's parents are expecting us for dinner. And the traffic back to Currabilly." "Of course," Margaret said quickly, though something cold settled in her stomach. "I understand completely, though I had hoped." "Well, it doesn't matter. The conversation limped along for the next hour. Margaret tried to engage the children, asking about school and friends. But Tommy was absorbed in his phone, while Sophie colored in a book she'd brought from home. Victoria made polite inquiries about Margaret's garden and her health, but her responses carried the mechanical quality of someone fulfilling an obligation. When they finally moved to the dining room, Margaret felt a familiar pride swell in her chest. The table looked magnificent, the lamb perfectly golden and fragrant, with rosemary from her garden. Roasted vegetables glistening with herb butter. The crystal glasses catching and reflecting the December light streaming through the windows. At the head of the table, Peter's empty chair waited, as it always did. As if he might yet arrive fashionably late with flowers and apologies. "This is quite a spread, Mum," Daniel said. And Margaret caught the first genuine warmth in his voice since he'd arrived. "You remember how your father always said Christmas dinner should be a feast for the senses?" Margaret began, lifting the carving knife. "He'd stand right here, where you are now, and make such a production of carving the lamb. He'd tell stories about his grandfather's farm in County Cork, how they'd—" "Margaret," Victoria's voice cut through the memory like a blade. "That's enough. The children don't need these outdated tales." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's hand froze mid-gesture, the carving knife trembling slightly. She looked around the table at Tommy, who had finally looked up from his phone, and was staring at his mother with something approaching shock at Sophie, whose coloring had stopped mid-stroke, at Daniel, whose face had gone carefully blank in the way that had always meant he was choosing not to choose sides. Margaret began, then stopped. The words she'd been about to speak about tradition, about keeping memories alive, about the importance of knowing where you came from, seemed to evaporate in the face of Victoria's cool dismissal. "Of course," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're quite right. Let's just eat." But the meal that followed was a shadow of the celebration Margaret had envisioned. Conversation was stilted, limited to safe topics. The weather, Tommy's football season, Sophie's art class. Margaret found herself weighing each word before speaking, terrified of saying something that might be deemed inappropriate or outdated. When Sophie asked about the family photographs on the sideboard, "Nana, who's that man in the uniform?" Victoria quickly redirected her attention to her food. When Tommy wondered aloud about the old clock on the mantelpiece, Daniel launched into a detailed explanation of traffic patterns between Marrickville and Currabilly. Margaret sat at her own table, surrounded by her family, and felt more alone than she had in the year since Peter's death. She was a guest at her own Christmas dinner, tolerated rather than welcomed, endured rather than embraced. The pavlova, when she finally brought it out, received polite praise but little enthusiasm. Sophie managed only a few bites before Victoria declared she'd had enough sugar for one day. Tommy asked for a second serving. But Victoria's sharp look made him push the plate away half-finished. "It's lovely as always, Mum," Daniel said, though Margaret noticed he'd barely touched his portion. "Just like Dad used to make. Your father never made pavlova in his life," Margaret replied with a shadow of her old spirit. "He could barely boil water without supervision." For a moment, Daniel's mask slipped, and she saw a glimmer of the boy who used to sit in this very chair, listening with wide eyes to stories of his grandparents and great-grandparents, of the family history that had brought them to this house, this life, this moment. But Victoria was already standing, checking her slim gold watch. "We really should be going. My parents will wonder where we are." The goodbyes were swift and polite. Sophie hugged her grandmother with genuine affection, whispering, "I love your pavlova, Nana," in her ear. Tommy managed an awkward embrace and mumbled thanks for lunch. Daniel kissed her cheek, the gesture feeling more like habit than affection. "We should do this more often," he said, though both of them knew it wasn't true. Victoria offered her hand for a formal handshake, as if Margaret were a business acquaintance rather than her mother-in-law. "Thank you for lunch, Margaret. It was nice." And then they were gone, the BMW disappearing around the corner toward their harbor views and dinner parties with people who mattered, leaving Margaret standing in her doorway like a figure in a photograph, frozen and increasingly irrelevant. She walked back through her house, seeing it suddenly through Victoria's eyes. The worn furniture that had seemed so full of character now looked shabby. The photographs that documented a life well lived appeared cluttered. The very walls seemed to close in with the weight of memories that no one wanted to share. In the kitchen, she began the mechanical task of clearing away the evidence of her failed Christmas. The lamb had barely been touched. There would be leftovers for days, a constant reminder of hopes that had exceeded reality. The pavlova sat accusingly on its crystal stand, perfect and barely appreciated. As she scraped plates into the rubbish bin, Margaret found herself wondering when it had all changed. When had her stories become outdated tales rather than family history? When had her home become a place to escape from rather than return to? When had she become a burden to be managed rather than a mother to be cherished? The photographs on the sideboard seemed to mock her now. There was Daniel at his law school graduation, her arm around his shoulders, both of them glowing with pride. There he was again at his wedding, young and happy, dancing with her too. "The way you look tonight," while Peter beamed from the sidelines. And there was Tommy as a toddler, flour in his hair from helping her bake Christmas cookies, his gap-toothed grin splitting his face with pure joy. When had they stopped making memories worth photographing? Margaret sank into Peter's chair, finally allowing the tears she'd held back all day to fall. The house settled around her with familiar creaks and sighs, as if it too were mourning the loss of something precious. The December light was fading now, casting long shadows across the floors where 3 generations had learned to walk, to run, to dance, to live. "Oh, Peter," she whispered to the empty room. "What would you do? How'd I make them understand that I'm not ready to become invisible?" But Peter, for all his wisdom and love, remained silent. The only sound was the ticking of the mantelpiece clock, the same clock Tommy had asked about, the one that had marked time for 60 years of family life. The one that would keep ticking long after everyone who remembered its stories was gone. As darkness fell over Marrickville, Margaret O'Connor sat alone in her Federation home. Surrounded by the remnants of Christmas dinner and the growing realization that she was becoming a stranger in her own life. Tomorrow, she knew, Daniel would call to thank her politely for lunch. To assure her that everyone had a lovely time. To maintain the fiction that everything was exactly as it should be. But tonight, for the first time since Peter's death, Margaret O'Connor felt truly alone. Not widowed, not bereaved, but forgotten, a woman whose stories had been deemed outdated, whose home had been judged insufficient, whose very presence had become an embarrassment to the family she had devoted her life to building. The house creaked around her, full of memories that no one wanted to hear. And Margaret, for the first time in her 70 years, wondered if it might be time to stop trying to be heard. Outside, the lights of Marrickville twinkled like fallen stars, each one representing a family, a home, a story being written. But inside number 47 Cardigan Street, the story seemed to be ending not with celebration or ceremony, but with the quiet fading of a voice that had once mattered, that had once been heard, that had once been home. The pavlova sat untouched on its crystal stand, perfect and unappreciated. Like the woman who had made it with hands that remembered love and a heart that still had so much to give. But who was listening? The clock ticked on, marking time, holding space, bearing witness to the loneliness of a mother who had raised a son to succeed in the world, only to discover that success sometimes meant leaving the past and the people who represented it behind. Christmas was over. The last Christmas in Marrickville, though Margaret didn't know it yet, had come to an end. Chapter 2 Currabilly Nights. 3 weeks had passed since that awkward Christmas dinner in Marrickville, and Margaret O'Connor found herself standing before her wardrobe mirror, second-guessing every choice. The invitation had arrived on cream-colored cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that seemed to mock her with its formality. Daniel and Victoria O'Connor request the pleasure of your company at a dinner party. Saturday, the 20th of January, 7:30 p.m. Harbor Views. Dress code cocktail attire. She held up her navy dress, the same one she'd worn to Christmas, then set it aside with a sigh. Too familiar. Too reminiscent of that painful afternoon. Her fingers traced the fabric of a black cocktail dress she'd bought for Peter's law firm retirement dinner 5 years ago. It still had the tags on it. She'd never had occasion to wear it after he passed. "What do you think, love?" she asked the empty bedroom, her voice carrying the same conversational tone she'd used with Peter for 43 years. Too formal? Not formal enough? The silence that answered her had become a companion of sorts, filled with the imagined responses of a man who had always known exactly what to say to calm her nerves. He would have told her she looked beautiful in anything. Would have reminded her that she was going to see her son and grandchildren, that nothing else mattered. But as Margaret fastened the black dress and applied her lipstick with shaking hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight, everything else mattered quite a lot. The taxi ride from Marrickville to Currabilly felt like a journey between worlds. As the driver navigated the familiar streets of her inner west neighborhood past the Lebanese bakery where she bought her Friday bread, the Italian grocer who always asked after her health, the corner pub where Peter used to meet his RSL mates, Margaret pressed her face to the window, memorizing details as if she might never see them again. Then they crossed the harbour bridge, and Sydney transformed. The city skyline glittered like scattered diamonds against the darkening sky, the opera house's white sails catching the last golden rays of summer sunset. Currabilly stretched before them, all manicured gardens and architectural statements, where people bought views instead of houses, where lives were curated like museum exhibitions. Daniel and Victoria's apartment building rose 30 floors above the harbour, its glass facade reflecting the lights of Luna Park across the water. Margaret had been here only twice before, once for Tommy's 13th birthday party, and once when Victoria's mother had visited from Melbourne. Both times, she'd felt like an intruder in her own son's life. The lobby was all marble and modern art, manned by a concierge who nodded politely but didn't quite meet her eyes. Margaret clutched her handbag, patent leather, purchased specifically for occasions like this, and rode the elevator to the 28th floor. Watching Sydney shrink below her through the glass walls. She had brought dessert, of course. It was her way, her offering, her attempt to contribute something meaningful to the evening. The chocolate tart had taken her 3 attempts to perfect. The pastry rolled and re-rolled until her kitchen looked like a flour bomb had exploded. She'd packaged it carefully in her best cake carrier, the one with roses painted around the rim that her mother had given her as a wedding gift. The elevator doors slid open with whispered efficiency, and Margaret stepped into a hallway that smelled of expensive perfume and fresh flowers. She found apartment 28B and pressed the doorbell, hearing chimes echo through what sounded like a space too large for a family of 4. Victoria answered the door, and Margaret's breath caught. Her daughter-in-law was stunning in a way that seemed almost architectural, every line clean, every surface polished to perfection. Her black dress was deceptively simple, the kind of garment that whispered rather than shouted its price tag. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves to her shoulders, and her makeup was so expertly applied it appeared she wasn't wearing any at all. "Margaret," Victoria said, her smile bright and sharp as crystal. "You look lovely." "Thank you, dear," Margaret replied, lifting the cake carrier slightly. "I brought dessert. Chocolate tart with." "Oh." Victoria's eyes flicked to the cake carrier, and something almost like panic crossed her features. That's very thoughtful, but Margaret, tonight isn't really. This isn't Marrickville." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stood frozen in the doorway, cake carrier in hand, watching her daughter-in-law's face rearrange itself into an expression of regret that felt anything but genuine. "I mean," Victoria continued, her voice dropping to a whisper as sounds of conversation and laughter drifted from within the apartment. "It's just that we've hired caterers, and the menu is very curated. The guests are expecting a certain level of, well, you understand." Margaret understood perfectly. Her homemade tart, crafted with love and 3 decades of baking experience, was not sophisticated enough for tonight's audience. She was not sophisticated enough. "Of course," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the hurt blooming in her chest. "I should have thought." Victoria took the cake carrier with the efficiency of someone disposing of evidence. "I'll just pop this in the kitchen. The staff will take care of it." Margaret knew she would never see that tart again, knew it would disappear into some service lift or rubbish bin, another offering deemed insufficient for the altar of Victoria's ambition. Come in," Victoria said, her hostess smile back in place as she guided Margaret into the apartment. The space that opened before Margaret was breathtaking and cold in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Sydney Harbour, where ferries traced silver lines across dark water and the city lights twinkled like earthbound constellations. The furniture was minimal and expensive, each piece appearing to have been selected not for comfort, but for its ability to make a statement about the people who could afford it. Art hung on walls painted in shades of gray and cream, abstract pieces that suggested sophistication through their very incomprehensibility. Fresh orchids sat in tall vases, their white blooms perfect and somehow menacing in their artificial-looking perfection. Everything was designed to impress, and Margaret had to admit it succeeded. The guests were already assembled, perhaps 20 people scattered across the living area in carefully orchestrated clusters. The men wore expensive suits with the casual confidence of those who never doubted their right to wear them. The women were variations on Victoria's theme, polished, preserved, dressed in clothes that cost more than Margaret's monthly pension. Daniel appeared at her elbow, resplendent in a charcoal suit that emphasized his height and the silver threading through his dark hair. He looked every inch the successful barrister, the kind of man who commanded respect in courtrooms and boardrooms alike. "Mum," he said, kissing her cheek with the same perfunctory affection he'd shown at Christmas. "You made it." "How was the trip from Marrickville?" "Fine, dear," Margaret replied, though something in his tone suggested the journey represented more than mere geography. "The taxi driver was lovely. Told me all about his granddaughter's university results." Daniel's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Right. Well, let me get you a drink. Wine?" As he guided her toward the bar area, a marble-topped island that probably cost more than Margaret's annual living expenses. She caught fragments of conversation from the groups around them. Talk of property prices in Double Bay, a skiing trip to Whistler, someone's son's acceptance to Oxford. These were people who lived in a rarefied atmosphere, breathing air that ordinary people couldn't afford. Margaret O'Connor, everyone, Daniel announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying the tone of someone fulfilling an obligation. "My mother." A few heads turned politely. There were murmurs of acknowledgement, brief smiles that felt more like social protocols than genuine warmth. Margaret found herself nodding and smiling in return, playing her part in the elaborate theater of upper-class courtesy. "How lovely to meet you," said a woman with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. "I'm Patricia Henley. My husband works with Daniel at Chambers." "Pleasure," Margaret replied, accepting a glass of wine from Daniel. "You have a beautiful view here." "Oh, this isn't our place," Patricia laughed, the sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "We're in Mossman, though I suppose the views are similar when you're at this height." Margaret nodded as if she understood the subtle hierarchy being described, as if the difference between Currabilly and Mossman was something that mattered to someone like her. She sipped her wine, something white and crisp that probably cost more per bottle than she spent on groceries in a week, and tried to find her place in conversations that seemed to flow around her like water around a stone. The caterers moved through the space with choreographed precision, offering canapés that looked like tiny works of art. Margaret accepted something involving salmon and dill, eating it carefully to avoid dropping crumbs on Victoria's pristine furniture. Around her, conversations continued. Talk of holiday houses in the Hamptons, investment opportunities in emerging markets, children attending private schools whose names she didn't recognize. "And what do you do, Margaret?" asked a younger woman with sharp cheekbones and an accent that spoke of expensive education. "I'm retired," Margaret replied, then felt compelled to add, "I was a primary school teacher for 35 years." "How admirable," the woman said with the tone people used when discussing charity work or other noble but ultimately irrelevant pursuits. "Public school, I assume?" "Yes," Margaret said, lifting her chin slightly. "Marrickville Primary. I taught 3 generations of some families." "How dedicated of you," came the reply, before the woman's attention was claimed by someone more interesting. Someone whose occupation presumably involved more zeros in their annual salary. Margaret found herself drifting toward the windows, drawn by the harbor view that never failed to take her breath away. She stood there, wine in hand, watching the lights of North Sydney shimmer across the water. Remembering the first time Peter had brought her to this side of the harbour. They'd been young then, newly married, and they'd stood on the Currabili foreshore eating fish and chips from newspaper. Marvelling at the Opera House construction site and dreaming of impossible futures. Quite something, isn't it? Margaret turned to find a distinguished man in his 60s standing beside her. Unlike the other guests, his smile seemed genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that suggested actual interest rather than social obligation. "It is," she agreed. "I never tire of seeing Sydney from this angle." "James Thornfield," he said, extending his hand. "I work with Daniel, senior partner at the firm. Margaret O'Connor, Daniel's mother." "Ah," James said, his expression warming further. "The famous Margaret. Daniel speaks of you often." Margaret felt a small flutter of pleasure at this unexpected revelation. "Does he?" "Oh yes. Always bragging about your cooking, your garden. He mentioned you taught for decades. That's admirable work. My wife was a teacher before the children came along. Always said it was the hardest job she ever had." For the first time since arriving, Margaret felt herself relax slightly. Here was someone who seemed to see her as a person, rather than an inconvenience, who understood that her life had value beyond her relationship to Daniel's success. It was challenging, she admitted, but rewarding. There's nothing quite like watching a child discover they can read, or seeing them solve a problem they thought was impossible. "I imagine Daniel was quite the student," James said with a chuckle. "Stubborn as a mule," Margaret replied, then immediately worried she'd said something inappropriate. But James laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "The best barristers usually are. That stubbornness serves him well in court." They talked for several minutes about teaching, about the changes in education, about the challenges facing young people today. Margaret found herself remembering why she'd loved her profession. Remembering the satisfaction of shaping young minds and building foundations for future success. For a brief moment, she felt like herself again, not Daniel's aging mother or Victoria's unwelcome obligation. But Margaret O'Connor, educator, woman of substance. But the moment couldn't last. Victoria appeared at James's elbow with the smooth efficiency of a hostess managing her guest list, her smile bright and territorial. "James, there's someone I'd like you to meet," she said, her hand touching his arm with practiced familiarity. "Margaret, perhaps you'd like to see the children? They're in Tommy's room, probably glued to their devices." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. Margaret was being redirected to her appropriate sphere, the children's area, away from the important adult conversations. She nodded, understanding her place, and made her way down the hallway toward the sounds of teenage voices and electronic beeping. Tommy's room was a testament to privileged adolescence. The space was larger than Margaret's living room, with built-in furniture and technology that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. A massive television dominated one wall, connected to gaming systems whose purposes Margaret couldn't begin to fathom. Tommy sat on his bed with a friend from school, both of them absorbed in some virtual battle being fought on handheld devices. "Nana Margaret," Sophie's voice rang out with genuine pleasure as she spotted her grandmother in the doorway. The little girl launched herself from her position on the floor, where she'd been coloring in what appeared to be a digital coloring book on a tablet. "Hello, my darling," Margaret said, accepting Sophie's enthusiastic hug with grateful arms. "What are you creating?" "It's a princess," Sophie explained, holding up the tablet to show her work. "But not a silly one. She's a scientist princess who solves problems with chemistry." "How wonderful," Margaret said, settling onto the floor beside her granddaughter. "Tell me about her adventures." As Sophie launched into an elaborate explanation of Princess Sophia's latest quest to save her kingdom through the strategic application of chemical compounds, Margaret felt some of the evening's tension ease from her shoulders. Here, at least, she was welcome. Here, her attention was valued rather than tolerated. Tommy glanced up from his game, offering a brief smile before returning to his virtual warfare. At 15, he was caught in that awkward space between childhood and adulthood, still pleased to see her but reluctant to show it in front of his friend. "How's school, Tommy?" Margaret asked during a lull in Sophie's storytelling. "Good, I guess," he replied with the universal teenage response to adult inquiries. "Lots of homework. HSC prep is mental. I'm sure you're managing beautifully," Margaret said. "Your father was always excellent at balancing his studies." "Yeah, well, Dad had you helping him," Tommy said, and there was something in his tone that made Margaret look at him more carefully. "Mum's always too busy with her committees and charity things." It was a small rebellion, barely perceptible, but Margaret caught it. The suggestion that perhaps the perfect family dynamic wasn't quite as perfect as it appeared from the outside. She filed the observation away, uncertain what to do with it but recognizing its significance. "Nana Margaret," Sophie said, tugging at her grandmother's sleeve, "will you tell me a story? A real one, about when Daddy was little?" Margaret's heart leapt at the request, then immediately contracted with anxiety. Victoria's words from Christmas echoed in her memory. "The children don't need outdated tales." But Sophie was looking at her with such hopeful eyes, and surely one small story couldn't hurt? "Well," Margaret began cautiously, "when your daddy was about your age, he decided he wanted to build a treehouse in our backyard." As she told the story, carefully edited to avoid anything Victoria might deem inappropriate, Margaret watched Sophie's face light up with delight. Even Tommy looked up from his game, drawn in despite himself by the tale of his Father's childhood engineering disaster and subsequent rescue by grandfather Peter. Dad actually got stuck up there? Sophie giggled. For how long? 3 hours, Margaret replied, smiling at the memory. Your grandfather had to borrow a ladder from the neighbors. And when he finally got Daniel down, your father announced he was going to be an architect instead of an engineer. But he became a lawyer, Tommy pointed out. That came later, Margaret said, after he realized he preferred arguing about buildings to actually constructing them. The children laughed, and for a moment, the room felt warm and connected in a way that reminded Margaret of her own childhood. When stories were treasures passed down through generations, when family history was something to be celebrated rather than concealed. But the warmth couldn't last. Victoria's voice carried down the hallway, calling for the children to come say goodnight to the guests. The spell was broken, reality reasserting itself like cold water after a warm bath. We have to go, Sophie said reluctantly. But will you tell me more stories next time? If your parents don't mind, Margaret replied carefully, the qualification tasting bitter on her tongue. As the children gathered their things and prepared to make their polite appearances in the living room, Margaret remained seated on Tommy's floor, surrounded by the detritus of privileged childhood. She could hear the party continuing beyond the bedroom walls, laughter and conversation, the clink of glasses. The subtle negotiations of social and professional advancement. She should rejoin the gathering, she knew. Should make more polite conversation with people who saw her as a curiosity at best, an embarrassment at worst. Should smile and nod and pretend that her presence was welcomed rather than endured. Instead, she stayed where she was, looking out Tommy's window at the harbor lights and thinking about the story she'd just told. It was such a small thing, really a tale of childhood misadventure and parental rescue. But it contained multitudes: Daniel's determination, Peter's gentle humor. The kind of family bond that made difficulties into shared memories rather than sources of shame. When had those bonds become liabilities? When had family history become something to be hidden rather than celebrated? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. James Thornfield peered around the corner, his expression concerned. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, he said. I noticed you disappeared, and I wanted to make sure you were all right. Margaret struggled to her feet, smoothing her black dress and attempting to reassemble her composure. Just spending some time with the grandchildren. They're wonderful company. I'm sure they are, James said, stepping into the room. My grandchildren are the light of my life. There's something magical about seeing the world. Chapter 3. Shut Out. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon in February, when the summer heat pressed against Margaret O'Connor's Federation home like a living thing, making the air shimmer and the old house creak with thermal expansion. She was in her kitchen, sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her forearms as she kneaded dough for the dinner rolls she'd planned to serve at Daniel's upcoming birthday. Dinner, the same recipe she'd used for his 21st, his 30th, every milestone that mattered. The phone's shrill ring cut through the afternoon stillness like a blade. "Daniel," she said, her voice brightening with the automatic joy that still came whenever she heard from her son. "I was just thinking about you. I'm making your favorite dinner rolls for Saturday, the ones with Mum." His voice was different, formal, rehearsed, the tone he used in courtrooms when delivering devastating cross-examinations. "We need to talk." Margaret's hands stilled in the dough, something cold settling in her stomach despite the oppressive heat. "Of course, darling. What's on your mind?" A pause. She could hear him breathing, could picture him in his Currabilly apartment. Probably standing by those floor-to-ceiling windows with his back to the harbor view, preparing to deliver a verdict she already knew she wouldn't want to hear. "About Saturday," he began, and she heard Victoria's voice in the background, sharp and insistent, though she couldn't make out the words. "About my birthday dinner, yes?" Margaret's voice came out smaller than she intended. The dough beneath her fingers had grown warm and sticky. "It's best if you don't come this year." The words hit her like a physical blow. The kitchen seemed to tilt, the familiar walls closing in as if the house itself was reacting to the shock. Margaret gripped the edge of the counter, flour-dusted fingers leaving white prints on the worn laminate. "What?" she whispered. Daniel's voice remained carefully controlled, each word measured and delivered with the precision of someone who had practiced this speech. "My colleagues will be there. Partners from the firm, important clients. Victoria's parents are flying up from Melbourne. It's a professional networking opportunity as much as a celebration." "But it's your birthday," Margaret said, and she hated how plaintive her voice sounded, how desperately she was grasping for something that made sense. "I'm your mother." "I know." For just a moment, his voice cracked slightly, revealing something raw beneath the professional composure. But he recovered quickly, that courtroom armor sliding back into place. "But your stories, the way you talk about the past, it might embarrass us." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the tick of the kitchen clock that had marked time through 40 years of birthday preparations. 40 years of celebrations where her presence had been not just welcome but essential. "My stories," she repeated slowly, testing the words like they were poison on her tongue. "About your father. About our family. About your childhood." They're not appropriate for this kind of gathering," Daniel said, and she could hear Victoria's voice again, sharper now, more insistent. "People won't understand. They'll think we're what? Common? Working class?" Not sophisticated enough for your harbor views and your networking opportunities? Mum, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Harder for whom? The words exploded out of her with a force that surprised them both. Harder for you to pretend you weren't raised by a primary school teacher in a modest house in Marrickville? Harder for you to maintain the fiction that you sprang fully formed from your mother's womb wearing a silk tie and speaking in legal terminology? That's not. Or is it harder for Victoria to have a mother-in-law who actually remembers when you wet the bed until you were 7? When you cried, because the other boys at school teased you about your lisp? When your father spent hours every night helping you with your reading because you struggled so much in year 2? Jesus, Mum. Daniel's composure finally cracked, his voice rising with a mixture of embarrassment and fury. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't air our private family business in front of important people. Private family business? Margaret laughed, and the sound was bitter as burnt coffee. You mean our life? Our actual, real life, with all its messy, human complications? The life that made you who you are? In the background, she could hear Victoria's voice clearly now, sharp and commanding. Tell her, Daniel. Just tell her and be done with it. The silence stretched between them, loaded with everything they weren't saying. Margaret closed her eyes, seeing her son not as the successful barrister he'd become, but as the 8-year-old boy who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms, who used to help her bake cookies on Sunday afternoons, who used to beg for just one more story before bedtime. Your stories might embarrass us, he said finally, the words coming out in a rush as if he needed to expel them before he lost his nerve. Your enthusiasm about the past, the way you talk to people like they're old friends, the way you don't understand boundaries. Each word was a knife, precisely placed for maximum damage. Margaret felt something fundamental breaking inside her chest, something that had held her together through Peter's death, through the lonely months that followed, through all the small signs that her place in Daniel's life was shrinking with each passing day. I see, she said quietly. It's just for this one evening, Daniel continued, his voice taking on a pleading quality that might have moved her if the damage hadn't already been done. Once I make partner, once we're more established, things will be different. But they both knew that was a lie. Once he made partner, there would be other networking opportunities, other professional obligations. Other reasons why Margaret O'Connor from Marrickville wasn't quite suitable for the life Daniel was building in Currabili. Your father would be ashamed of you, Margaret said, and she felt a grim satisfaction at the sharp intake of breath from the other end of the line. Peter worked 3 jobs to put you through university. He sold his car to buy your law books. He wore the same suit to court for 15 years so you could have the clothes you needed for internships. And you're embarrassed by the stories of how much he loved you? Don't. Daniel's voice was tight with warning. Don't bring Dad into this. He's already in it, Margaret shot back. Every story I tell is about him. About us. About the family that sacrificed everything to give you the opportunities you're now using to shut us out. I'm not shutting you out. Then what would you call this? The question hung between them, unanswered and unanswerable. In the background, Margaret could hear the sounds of Daniel's other life, Victoria's heels clicking across marble floors, the distant hum of expensive appliances. The muffled sounds of harbor traffic 28 floors below. A world that had no room for flour-dusted hands and kitchen table conversations, for stories that reminded everyone where he'd really come from. I have to go, Daniel said finally. I have a client meeting. Of course you do, Mum, but Margaret had already hung up. The phone slipped from her hand like a dead thing, clattering against the kitchen counter before settling into silence. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the half-kneaded dough that would never become dinner rolls, at the flour scattered across surfaces she'd cleaned that morning, at the birthday card she'd already written in her careful script, to my darling son on his 40th birthday. May this year bring you all the happiness you deserve. The irony was devastating. Moving like someone in a dream, Margaret walked through her house, seeing it with new eyes. The photographs that lined the hallways, Daniel's school pictures, his graduation, his wedding, the grandchildren's visits suddenly felt like monuments to a relationship that existed only in her imagination. Had she been deluding herself all these years? Had she been clinging to a version of her son that no longer existed, if it ever had? She found herself in the dining room, staring at the table where she'd already begun planning the birthday celebration. She'd mentally choreographed the entire evening, Daniel's favorite lamb roast with rosemary from her garden, the dinner rolls he'd loved since childhood, the chocolate birthday cake with buttercream frosting that took her 3 hours to perfect. She'd even bought new candles, 40 of them, because some traditions mattered, didn't they? Apparently not. With mechanical precision, Margaret began setting the table anyway. One place setting. Her mother's china, the good plates that had been saved for special occasions, for family gatherings, for moments that mattered. She set out the crystal glasses that Peter had given her for their 20th anniversary. The silver cutlery that had been a wedding gift from his parents. The linen napkins she'd embroidered with roses during her first pregnancy. All of it for an audience of one. She cooked the lamb anyway, though she had no appetite for it. Habit and heartbreak drove her through the familiar motions, seasoning the meat with herbs from her garden, preparing vegetables that would feed a family. She no longer seemed to have, making enough food for the celebration that would never come. The house filled with the sense of a feast that would go largely uneaten, a birthday dinner for a son who wouldn't be there. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself talking to Peter's photograph, carrying on both sides of conversations they would never have again. He's forgotten who raised him, she said to the silver-framed image on the mantelpiece. Peter smiled back at her, frozen in time at their last anniversary dinner. Proud and happy and completely unaware that their son would someday be ashamed of the stories of their love. "What did we do wrong?" she asked the empty room. "We gave him everything. We sacrificed everything. We loved him more than our own lives. And somehow, that made us an embarrassment." The silence that answered her was complete and final. By evening, the house was filled with the ghosts of celebrations past. Margaret sat at her elaborately set table, surrounded by enough food for a small army, staring at the empty chairs where her family should have been. She'd changed into her best dress navy blue with the small pearl buttons, the one Daniel had complimented years ago and done. Her hair, applied lipstick, prepared for a party where she was the only guest. The lamb was perfect. The vegetables were tender. The dinner rolls would have been Daniel's favorites, if he'd been there to taste them. Instead, Margaret ate in silence, each bite a reminder of hopes that had been shattered by a single phone call. She was halfway through her solitary meal when the doorbell rang. For a wild moment, her heart leapt. Perhaps Daniel had changed his mind. Perhaps he'd realized what he was throwing away, what he was choosing to lose. Perhaps, but it was Mrs. Chen from next door, holding a plate of dumplings, and wearing an expression of concern that immediately told Margaret her neighbor had heard the raised voices through the thin walls. "Margaret, dear," Mrs. Chen said, her accented English warm with genuine caring. "I thought you might like some company. And perhaps you could use these?" Margaret looked at the dumplings, homemade, still warm, offered with the kind of generous heart that didn't calculate cost or social standing, and felt tears she'd been holding back all day finally spill over. "Come in, Linda," she managed. "Please. I have far too much food and not nearly enough people to share it with." Mrs. Chen's face creased with understanding as she took in the elaborately set table, the feast prepared for absent family. The devastating loneliness of a woman who had been abandoned by the very people she'd spent her life nurturing. "Ah," she said simply. "Family troubles. My son," Margaret said, and the words came out broken and raw. "He doesn't want me at his birthday dinner. Says I might embarrass him with my stories. Says I don't understand boundaries." Mrs. Chen set down her plate of dumplings and, without asking permission, began clearing away the extra place settings, reducing Margaret's table for 8 to a more manageable table for 2. The action was both practical and deeply kind, acknowledging the reality of the situation while refusing to let Margaret drown in its implications. "Sons," Mrs. Chen said as she worked, her voice carrying the weight of her own experiences. "They think success means forgetting where they came from. My eldest, he's a surgeon now in Melbourne. Last time he visited, he was embarrassed because I still hang laundry on the line instead of using the dryer. Said it looked too ethnic for his taste. Margaret watched her neighbor's efficient movements, grateful for the company, but also devastated that her pain was so recognizable, so common that it required no explanation. "What did you do?" Margaret asked. "I told him that the line-dried sheets he slept on as a child gave him the comfort and security that made him confident enough to become a surgeon, Mrs. Chen replied matter-of-factly. "Then I served him dinner and made him do the dishes, just like when he was 12. Despite her heartbreak, Margaret found herself smiling. "And he complained the entire time. But he did the dishes." They ate together in companionable silence. Margaret's elaborate lamb dinner supplemented by Mrs. Chen's perfect dumplings, the fusion somehow more satisfying than either dish would have been alone. As they ate, Mrs. Chen told stories of her own children, their struggles to balance success with heritage, their slow journey toward understanding that their mother's sacrifices had been gifts rather than burdens. "Your son will come back," she said finally, as they cleared the dishes together. They always do. Once they realize that running from their past means running from themselves. "And if he doesn't?" Mrs. Chen paused in her cleaning, looking at Margaret with eyes that held decades of hard-won wisdom. "Then you build a new family, with people who appreciate your stories instead of being ashamed of them. With people who understand that love is not a burden to be managed, but a gift to be treasured." After Mrs. Chen left, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the birthday card she'd written for Daniel. The words that had seemed so natural that morning now felt foreign. As if they'd been written by someone else, for someone else, about a relationship that existed only in her imagination. She tore it up. Then she sat down at the same kitchen table where she'd helped Daniel with his homework, where she'd listened to his teenage complaints about unfair teachers and impossible assignments, where she'd celebrated his acceptance to law school with champagne and tears of pride. She took out a fresh piece of paper and began to write a different kind of letter. "Daniel, I want you to know that I understand. You've built a life that's everything your father and I dreamed for you: successful, respected, financially secure. You move in circles we never imagined, with people who speak a language we never learned. But I also want you to know that every story I tell, every embarrassing memory I share, is a love letter. Not just to your childhood, but to the man you became because of that childhood. Peter's sacrifices, our struggles, the modest life we built in this modest house, all of it was worth it because it gave the world Daniel O'Connor, brilliant barrister, devoted father, successful man. If remembering that makes you uncomfortable, if honoring that journey embarrasses you in front of your colleagues, then perhaps the problem isn't with my stories. Perhaps it's with people who would think less of you for having parents who loved you enough to give you everything. Even if everything wasn't very much by their standards. I won't attend your birthday dinner, as requested. But I want you to know that every day, I thank God for the privilege of being your mother even on the days when you wish I weren't. Happy birthday, my darling boy. All my love, Mum." She sealed the letter in an envelope, addressed it in her careful script, and placed it on the kitchen table where it would wait for tomorrow's post. Then she walked through her house, turning off lights, checking locks, performing the evening rituals that had remained constant even as everything else in her world shifted and changed. In her bedroom, she sat at her dressing table, removing the jewelry she'd worn for a celebration that never happened, wiping away makeup applied for guests who never came. In the mirror, she saw a woman she was still learning to recognize, not just Peter's widow or Daniel's mother, but Margaret O'Connor, individual, complete in herself. Even when everyone else saw her as incomplete without her family roles. The phone rang once more before she went to bed. For a moment, she thought it might be Daniel, calling to apologize, to take back his words, to restore the relationship she'd thought was unbreakable. But it was a wrong number, someone looking for a pizza place, and the disappointment was so sharp it took her breath away. That night, Margaret lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of her house, the settling boards, the distant traffic. The midnight freight train that had marked time in her neighborhood for decades. These were the sounds of her world, her reality, her truth. They were not sophisticated or impressive or suitable for networking opportunities. But they were hers, and perhaps, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, that was enough. Perhaps being authentic was more valuable than being appropriate. Perhaps telling the truth was more important than managing impressions. Perhaps, in trying so hard to become someone worthy of Daniel's new life, she had forgotten the value of the life she'd actually lived. Tomorrow, she would mail the letter. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of accepting that her son had made his choice. Tomorrow, she would start learning how to be Margaret O'Connor, not just for other people, but for herself. But tonight, she grieved. For the relationship she thought she had. For the son she thought she knew. For the grandmother her grandchildren were losing, whether they realized it or not. For the stories that would go untold. The memories that would die with her. The love that had been deemed inappropriate for public consumption. Outside her window, Marrickville slept on, unaware that one of its own had been exiled from her own family. Cast out not for any crime or cruelty, but for the simple offense of remembering too much, loving too openly, and refusing to be ashamed of the life that had made her son's success possible. The birthday dinner would go on without her. The networking would happen. The partnerships would be discussed. The career advancement would be strategically managed. Daniel would celebrate turning 40 surrounded by people who could further his ambitions, enhance his reputation, advance his cause. And Margaret O'Connor would remain in Marrickville, in the house where she'd raised him, surrounded by the stories he no longer wanted to hear, holding on to memories he could no longer afford to claim. But she would survive this. Chapter 4. A New Feast. 3 weeks after the phone call that had shattered her world, Margaret O'Connor stood in her kitchen at 5:30 a.m. But this time she wasn't baking for ungrateful family members. This time, she was preparing for war. The transformation had begun the morning after she'd mailed that letter to Daniel. She'd woken up feeling something she hadn't experienced in months: fury. Not the quiet, dignified disappointment she'd been carrying like a weight in her chest, but white-hot, cleansing rage that burned through her veins like liquid fire. They wanted to erase her, make her invisible, treat her like some embarrassing relic to be hidden away. Fine, she'd show them exactly what they'd thrown away. Right then, Peter, she said to his photograph as she tied her apron with military precision. Time to remind this neighborhood what Margaret O'Connor can really do when she puts her mind to it. The plan had crystallized over those 3 weeks with the strategic brilliance of a woman who had managed 35 rowdy 8-year-olds for decades. If Daniel was embarrassed by her stories, her enthusiasm, her working-class roots, then perhaps it was time to show him and everyone else exactly how powerful those roots could be. She'd started with Mrs. Chen, of course. During their shared meal after Daniel's devastating rejection, her neighbor had mentioned something that stuck in Margaret's mind like a seed waiting to sprout: you build a new family with people who appreciate your stories instead of being ashamed of them. The next morning, Margaret had knocked on Mrs. Chen's door with a proposition that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. "Linda," she'd said, standing on her neighbor's doorstep with the confidence of a general marshalling troops, "how would you feel about having a proper Australian Christmas dinner in March?" Mrs. Chen had looked at her with concern. "Margaret, are you feeling well?" "Better than I have in months," Margaret had replied, and it was true. The fury had given way to something even more dangerous: purpose. "I've been thinking about what you said, about building new families. And I realized I've been going about this all wrong." Over tea and Mrs. Chen's excellent almond biscuits, Margaret had laid out her plan. She would throw the most spectacular dinner party Marrickville had ever seen. Not for networking or social climbing or professional advancement, but for the simple, revolutionary act of celebrating life, love, and community with people who actually wanted to be there. "But who will come?" Mrs. Chen had asked practically. Margaret's smile had been sharp as a blade. "Everyone Daniel would absolutely hate to see me entertaining." The guest list had grown organically, like a beautiful virus spreading through the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen, obviously, and her husband Frank, who ran the corner news agency and knew everyone's business better than they knew it themselves. Old Tom Bradley from 3 doors down, the widower who'd been Peter's drinking buddy and who could tell stories that would make a sailor blush. The young couple next door, Jake and Marcus, whose Saturday morning arguments about whose turn it was to mow the lawn had become neighborhood entertainment. Then Margaret had gotten creative. She'd walked down to the local community center, where she'd volunteered for the literacy program years ago, and struck up conversations with people she'd never really noticed before. Sarah, the single mother studying nursing part-time while working 2 jobs. Giuseppe, the elderly Italian gentleman who still made his own wine and had opinions about everything from politics to pasta. Aisha, the refugee from Somalia who was learning English and had eyes that held stories Margaret desperately wanted to hear. With each invitation, Margaret felt herself growing stronger, more alive, more authentically herself than she'd been in years. These were her people, not by blood or social status, but by choice, by genuine connection, by the simple human recognition that everyone had stories worth telling and lives worth celebrating. The preparation had been a revelation. Instead of the anxious, desperate energy she'd poured into previous family gatherings, Margaret found herself cooking with joy. Not to impress or appease or meet some impossible standard of perfection, but simply because she loved feeding people, loved watching faces light up when they tasted something delicious, loved the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into memories. She'd spent 3 days preparing, but it felt like play rather than work. The lamb was rubbed with herbs from her garden, rosemary and thyme that Peter had planted years ago, still growing strong despite everything that had changed. The vegetables were sourced from Giuseppe's nephew's market stall, where she'd been treated like royalty once word got out about her dinner party. The wine had been a gift from Tom Bradley, who'd raided his late wife's cellar, because Eleanor would have loved this whole bloody show. But the pièce de résistance was the pavlova. Not 1, but 3 of them, a traditional white one with passion fruit. A chocolate version that would have made Daniel weep if he'd had the sense to appreciate it, and an experimental rose-flavored creation that had taken Margaret 4 attempts to perfect. Each one was a masterpiece of sugar and air and stubborn determination, a sweet middle finger to everyone who'd ever dismissed her cooking as merely homemade. Now, as the March sun climbed higher over Marrickville, Margaret surveyed her domain with the satisfaction of a queen preparing to hold court. Her dining room had been transformed, the table extended to its absolute maximum and dressed with every piece of china, crystal, and silverware she owned. She'd mixed patterns with reckless abandon, her mother's roses with her grandmother's gold rim. Her wedding crystal with the glasses she'd collected from years of attending RSL functions. It should have been chaos, but instead it was glorious, a celebration of accumulated life rather than curated perfection. The house buzzed with anticipation. She'd spent the morning arranging flowers from her garden, not the sterile orchids of Victoria's world, but honest-to-God blooms that had been loved into existence in actual dirt. Roses and lavender, jasmine and hibiscus, creating a riot of color and scent that announced to anyone who entered that this was a place where real life happened. By 11 o'clock, the first guests were arriving. and Margaret felt a thrill of nervous excitement that reminded her of her teaching days. When she'd stand in front of a new class full of possibilities and challenges. Mrs. Chen arrived with Frank, both of them bearing covered dishes despite Margaret's protests that she had everything handled. Behind them came Giuseppe, resplendent in his best suit and carrying a bottle of wine that looked older than some of her guests. Tom Bradley shuffled up the path with a grin that suggested he'd already been sampling his contribution to the festivities. "Margaret, you magnificent woman," he boomed, loud enough to alert the entire street to the proceedings. "This is what a proper party looks like." One by one, they came. Sarah with her 3 children, who immediately made themselves at home in Margaret's back garden, their laughter floating through the windows like music. Jake and Marcus, bearing flowers and looking slightly overwhelmed by the invitation to join a real Australian family dinner. Aisha, gorgeous in traditional dress and carrying something wrapped in aromatic spices that made Margaret's mouth water just from the smell. And then, just as Margaret was beginning to think everyone had arrived, the doorbell rang one more time. She opened the door to find a young woman with short, dark hair and intelligent eyes, holding a professional-looking camera and wearing an expression of nervous determination. "Mrs. O'Connor? I'm Emma Rodriguez from the Inner West Courier. Your neighbor Mrs. Chen mentioned you were having an amazing community dinner party, and I wondered, would you mind if I took some photos? This is exactly the kind of local community story we love to feature." For a moment, Margaret's old instincts kicked in, the urge to deflect attention, to minimize herself, to worry about what people might think. But then she looked over Emma's shoulder at her house, full of laughter and conversation and the kind of genuine warmth that money couldn't buy, and felt that familiar surge of revolutionary purpose. "Of course, dear," she said, stepping aside to let Emma in. "But I hope you're hungry. There's always room for one more at this table." What followed was 3 hours of pure magic. Margaret moved through her transformed home like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink, facilitating introductions, encouraging stories, watching with deep satisfaction as barriers dissolved and connections formed. Giuseppe regaled the table with tales of his journey from Sicily to Sydney. His heavily accented English painting vivid pictures of a young man's courage and determination. Sarah talked about her studies, her dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse, her fierce pride in her children's achievements despite their financial struggles. Aisha shared stories of her homeland, her harrowing journey to Australia, her gratitude for the kindness of strangers who had become friends. And through it all, Margaret felt herself blooming. Not the careful, contained version of herself she'd been trying to present to Daniel's world, but the full, unedited, gloriously imperfect woman she actually was. She told stories about her teaching days, about the children who'd touched her heart, about the small miracles and daily disasters that had made up her professional life. She talked about Peter with joy instead of grief, sharing memories that made everyone laugh instead of politely waiting for the sadness to pass. "You know," Tom Bradley said as they moved into the dessert course, his face flushed with wine and contentment, "this is what Peter would have wanted. A proper celebration with proper people who give a damn about each other." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, cleansing tears. "He would have loved this," she agreed. "He always said the best parties were the ones where everyone went home feeling better than when they arrived." Emma had been moving through the gathering like a benevolent ghost, capturing moments with her camera. Giuseppe teaching the children Italian curse words while their mother pretended not to listen, Aisha and Mrs. Chen comparing cooking techniques across cultural boundaries, Marcus and Jake deep in animated discussion with Tom about the best football teams of the 1970s. But the moment that would change everything came when Emma asked Margaret to pose with the three Pavlovas. All of them perfect and glistening in the afternoon light streaming through her dining room windows. "Tell me about these," Emma said, adjusting her camera settings. "They're absolutely stunning. This is my signature dessert," Margaret said, and for the first time in months, there was no apologetic qualification in her voice. "No, just homemade, or nothing fancy. Just quiet pride in something she did exceptionally well. I've been perfecting the recipe for 30 years. These are made with love and proper technique, no shortcuts, no substitutions, no compromises." Emma's camera clicked and whirred, capturing Margaret in her element, surrounded by the fruits of her labor and the friends who appreciated them. In those images, Margaret looked like what she actually was, a woman of substance, skill, and deep human warmth, presiding over a gathering that radiated authenticity and joy. As the afternoon wound down and guests began to make their reluctant departures, each one hugged Margaret with genuine affection and promises to reciprocate the invitation soon. Sarah slipped her a note with her phone number, writing, "Thank you for reminding me what community looks like." Giuseppe kissed both her cheeks and declared her an honorary Italian grandmother. Aisha presented her with a small jar of the spice blend she'd brought, along with careful instructions for its use. Even Emma lingered, helping with the cleanup despite Margaret's protests and chatting about her own grandmother, who'd been the social center of her neighborhood in Melbourne until dementia had stolen her spark. "This was beautiful," Emma said as she prepared to leave. "Exactly the kind of story that reminds people what really matters. I'll have the photos ready in a few days, and the article should run next week." "Article?" Margaret said, suddenly realizing the implications of the afternoon's documentation. Emma grinned. "Mrs. O'Connor, this isn't just a dinner party story. This is a celebration of community values, of intergenerational friendship. of the kind of authentic hospitality that's becoming rare in our digitally connected but emotionally disconnected world. People need to read about this. After everyone had gone, Margaret stood in her kitchen, surveying the beautiful devastation of a successful party. Dirty dishes were stacked everywhere. Wine glasses held the remnants of good conversations. And the air still held the mingled scents of her cooking and her guests' contributions. It should have been overwhelming, but instead it felt like victory. She was halfway through the washing up when her phone rang. For a wild moment, she thought it might be Daniel, somehow having heard about the party, calling to. What? Apologize? Demand she stop embarrassing him? She couldn't imagine what he'd say, but it didn't matter, because it wasn't Daniel at all. It was her old principal, Helen Morrison, now retired but still connected to the education community. "Margaret, dear." Helen's voice was warm with affection and bright with something that sounded like excitement. "I just had the most interesting phone call. Are you sitting down?" "I'm washing dishes," Margaret replied, cradling the phone against her shoulder. "What's going on?" "The Department of Education wants to interview you for a feature article about inspiring retired teachers. Apparently, someone from the local paper contacted them about your work in the community. And they're putting together a series about educators who continue to make a difference after retirement." Margaret nearly dropped the glass she was washing. "I'm sorry, what?" "They want to showcase teachers who embody the profession's values beyond the classroom. You know, community building, lifelong learning, nurturing relationships across generations. They mentioned something about your regular dinner parties bringing together diverse community members." Margaret looked around her destroyed kitchen, at the evidence of her one revolutionary dinner party, and started to laugh. Not polite, restrained laughter, but the full-throated sound of a woman who had just realized the universe had a sense of humor. "Helen," she managed between giggles, "I think there might be some confusion. I had one dinner party. Today, literally just finished cleaning up." There was a pause. "One dinner party?" "One dinner party. Though," Margaret added, looking at the photo Emma had insisted on taking of her with her pavlovas. "I suspect it might not be the last." "Well," Helen said, and Margaret could hear the grin in her voice, "it must have been quite a dinner party." As Margaret finished cleaning up and prepared for bed, she found herself humming for the first time since Peter's death. Not sadly, not wistfully, but with genuine contentment. She'd proven something to herself today, that she was enough, exactly as she was. That her stories had value, that her hospitality was a gift, that her presence was something to be celebrated rather than managed. The phone rang twice more before she went to sleep. Once was Mrs. Chen, calling to thank her and to suggest they make the gatherings monthly. "Frank hasn't stopped talking about Giuseppe's wine recommendations," she said. "And I think Sarah could use regular friendship from women who've been through raising children." The second call came just as Margaret was settling into bed. She almost didn't answer, but something made her reach for the receiver. "Is this Margaret O'Connor?" The voice was young, professional, slightly breathless with excitement. "Yes," Margaret replied cautiously. "Mrs. O'Connor, this is David Kim from Channel 7 News. We just saw the most amazing photos from your community dinner party today. And we'd love to do a story about neighborhood connections and the importance of community elders. Would you be interested in an interview?" Margaret sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. Channel 7? The photographer from the Inner West Courier posted some images on social media, and they've been shared hundreds of times already. People are calling it, "This is the real Sydney Christmas and what community actually looks like." The response has been incredible. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a tectonic movement of possibility and power. She thought about Daniel, probably at another networking dinner at this very moment, carefully managing his image and calculating social advantages. She thought about Victoria, no doubt discussing charity, board positions and investment opportunities with people who measured worth in harbour views and designer labels. "Mrs. O'Connor, are you still there?" "Yes," Margaret said, and her voice was steady and strong. "Yes, I'd be very interested in an interview." After she hung up, Margaret sat in her darkened bedroom, looking out at the lights of Marrickville, her neighborhood, her community, her world. Tomorrow, apparently, that world was going to get a lot bigger. She thought about the letter she'd written to Daniel 3 weeks ago, about survival and dignity and learning to be herself for herself. She'd had no idea then how prophetic those words would prove to be. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Emma, the photographer, Mrs. O'Connor, you're trending on social media. #Real Sydney Christmas is everywhere. Hope you're ready for some attention." Margaret smiled in the darkness. Ready? She'd been preparing for this her entire life, teaching children to be brave, building community one relationship at a time. Learning to cook with love instead of obligation. Developing the kind of authentic relationships that Daniel's world couldn't understand or replicate. She was more than ready. She was magnificent. And tomorrow, the entire city was going to find out exactly what Daniel O'Connor had thrown away when he decided his mother's stories weren't sophisticated enough for his new life. The revolution had begun with a single dinner party. But revolutions, as any good teacher knew, had a way of growing beyond their original scope. Margaret O'Connor was about to become famous. And her son was about to discover that embarrassment, like success, was a two-way street. The game had changed, and this time, Margaret was holding all the cards. Chapter 5. The knock at the door. The Channel 7 news segment had aired at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, Margaret O'Connor was the most famous grandmother in Sydney. She woke to the sound of her phone ringing, not the gentle trill she was accustomed to, but an insistent, continuous symphony that suggested the outside world had discovered her existence in a very big way. Bleary-eyed and still in her nightgown, she padded to the kitchen to find 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and an email inbox that had exploded overnight. The first text was from Mrs. Chen. "Margaret, you're on the Today Show website. You're famous." The second was from Emma, the photographer. "OMG Mrs. O'Connor. 2.3 million views on Facebook. My editor is losing his mind." The third was from a number she didn't recognize. "Hello Mrs. O'Connor. This is Amanda from the project. Would you be available for a phone interview this morning?" Margaret set down her phone with shaking hands and turned on her television. The morning news was running a story about Sydney's Pavlova grandmother and the dinner party that restored faith in community. There, on her screen, were Emma's photos from Sunday's gathering, herself surrounded by her diverse group of neighbors, laughing with genuine joy, presiding over her homemade feast with the confidence of a woman who knew her worth. But the real shock came when the news anchor transitioned to their next story. In other news, prominent Sydney barrister Daniel O'Connor found himself at the centre of a social media firestorm last night after it was revealed that the viral Pavlova grandmother is his mother, the same mother he reportedly excluded from recent family celebrations. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. On screen, they were showing a photo of Daniel in his expensive suit, leaving his Currabilly apartment building with Victoria beside him, both of them looking like they were fleeing a crime scene. The caption read, "Barrister Daniel O'Connor refuses to comment on family rift." Her phone rang again. This time, she answered. "Nana Margaret?" Sophie's voice was small, confused, but underneath the confusion was something that sounded almost like awe. "Are you really famous now?" "Sophie, darling," Margaret managed, her heart clenching at the sound of her granddaughter's voice. "How did you get my number?" "I memorized it," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "Daddy took our phones away, but I used the house phone when Mummy wasn't looking." "Nana, why are people being mean about Daddy on the internet?" Margaret closed her eyes, feeling a complex mix of triumph and guilt wash over her. She'd wanted to show Daniel what he'd thrown away, but she hadn't anticipated that her success would become his humiliation. Or perhaps, if she was being honest with herself, she had anticipated it and simply hadn't cared enough to stop. "Sometimes," Margaret said carefully, "when people make choices, there are consequences they don't expect." "Tommy's really upset," Sophie continued. "He said Daddy's work friends are all talking about us now. He said you made Daddy look bad." And there it was, the accusation Margaret had been dreading, delivered with the devastating honesty that only children possessed. She had made Daniel look bad. She had exposed the ugly truth of their family dynamic to the entire city. She had turned her pain into his public humiliation. She should feel guilty. She should feel ashamed. Instead, she felt powerful. "Sophie," she said gently, "can I tell you something important? Sometimes adults make mistakes. Sometimes they forget that love is more important than looking good to other people. And sometimes, when that happens, the people they've hurt need to remind them what really matters." "Are you reminding Daddy what really matters?" Margaret looked around her kitchen at the flowers from Sunday's party still brightening her windowsill, at the thank you cards that had started arriving from her guests, at the evidence of a life being rebuilt on her own terms, and smiled. "Yes, darling, I suppose I am." After Sophie hung up, clearly afraid of being caught, Margaret's phone immediately rang again. This time it was a number she recognized with a jolt of electric anticipation. Daniel's office. "Mrs. O'Connor?" The voice was professional, female, carefully neutral. "This is Rebecca, Mr. O'Connor's assistant. He's requested an urgent meeting with you. Would you be available this afternoon?" Margaret felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest. After weeks of silence, after being explicitly told she wasn't welcome at his birthday celebration, after being treated like an embarrassment to be managed, now Daniel wanted an urgent meeting. "I'm rather busy today," Margaret said, and it wasn't entirely a lie. 3 more television producers had called in the last hour, and the local council had reached out about featuring her in their Community Leadership Awards. What time did he have in mind? "He's quite flexible, Mrs. O'Connor. He could come to you, if that would be more convenient." Daniel, coming to Marrickville. Coming to the house where she'd raised him, the house he'd been steadily distancing himself from. The house that was apparently no longer embarrassing enough to avoid when his reputation was on the line. "Tell him to come at 4 o'clock, Margaret said. "And Rebecca? Tell him to use the front door like any other visitor. The family entrance privileges have been suspended." By 3:30, Margaret had transformed herself with the same strategic precision she'd applied to Sunday's dinner party. She'd chosen her clothes carefully, not the apologetic navy dress she usually wore for Daniel's visits, but a crisp white blouse and dark trousers that spoke of competence and authority. She'd done her hair at the local salon, where the stylists had treated her like visiting royalty after seeing her on television. She'd even applied makeup with more care than usual, understanding instinctively that this confrontation required her to look like the formidable woman the media was portraying her as. The house, too, had been prepared for battle. She'd arranged Emma's photos from Sunday's party prominently on the mantelpiece, visual evidence of her newfound independence and success. Fresh flowers from her garden, the same garden Daniel had once played in, filled every room with color and life. The dining room table was set for afternoon tea, but with her finest china and crystal, the kind of display that said, I am a woman of substance and refinement, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not." At exactly 4 o'clock, there was a knock at the front door. Not the casual entry of a son coming home, but the formal announcement of someone requesting permission to enter. Margaret took her time answering, letting him wait on the doorstep like any other visitor, like any other supplicant seeking an audience. When she finally opened the door, she had to suppress a gasp at what she saw. Daniel looked terrible. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. His face was drawn with exhaustion and what looked suspiciously like panic. Victoria stood behind him, her perfect composure intact but her eyes holding the sharp calculation of someone assessing damage and planning counterattacks. Behind them, lurking at the garden gate, was Tommy. 15 years old and radiating the particular misery of a teenager caught in adult drama he couldn't control or escape. He met Margaret's eyes with an expression that seemed to plead for understanding, for forgiveness, for some kind of return to the way things used to be. "Mum," Daniel said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. "We need to talk." Margaret stepped aside to let them enter, noting with grim satisfaction how Victoria's eyes swept the room, clearly cataloguing every detail for future reference. The photos from Sunday's party drew her attention immediately, and Margaret watched her daughter-in-law's face tighten as she processed the implications. "Please, sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to the living room, where she'd entertained more genuine warmth in 3 hours on Sunday than she'd experienced in 3 years of Daniel's visits. "I've made tea." The ritual of serving tea gave Margaret time to observe her son more closely. He was a mess, she realized with a mixture of satisfaction and maternal concern. His hands shook slightly as he accepted the cup, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "Mum," he began again, then stopped, seemingly unable to find the words he'd presumably rehearsed on the drive over. Victoria had no such difficulties. She launched into what was clearly a prepared speech with the efficiency of someone accustomed to damage control. "Margaret," she said, her voice carrying its usual blend of condescension and impatience, "I think we need to discuss the situation that's developed. The media attention has become quite problematic for Daniel's career." Margaret sipped her tea and said nothing, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. She'd learned this technique in the classroom. Sometimes the most powerful response was no response at all. "His chambers are concerned about the negative publicity," Victoria continued, clearly expecting some kind of reaction. "The senior partners are asking questions. There's talk of postponing his partnership consideration until this situation is resolved." "What situation is that?" Margaret asked mildly. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "The situation where his mother has made him look like some kind of cruel son who abandons his aging parent." "Ah," Margaret said, setting down her teacup with delicate precision. You mean the situation where the truth became public? Daniel flinched as if she'd slapped him. Mum, it's not that simple. You don't understand the pressure. Don't I? Margaret's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the silk now. Daniel, I spent 35 years managing pressure. 30 children per class. Parents who thought their little darlings could do no wrong. Administrators who cared more about budgets than education. Government policies that changed with every election. I understand pressure very well. She stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, where Emma's photos captured the joy and community of Sunday's gathering. What I don't understand is how the son I raised, the boy who used to help me bake cookies for the school fundraiser, who cried when his pet goldfish died, who once told me I was the most important person in his whole world, became a man who thinks his mother's love is an embarrassment. Tommy made a small sound from his corner of the sofa, something between a sob and a laugh. Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, and saw Peter's eyes staring back at her, confused, hurt, but also something else. Something that looked almost like pride. You're trending on TikTok, Nana, he said suddenly, his teenage voice cracking with emotion. There's this whole hashtag about grandparents being awesome. And everyone's talking about how their grandparents have the best stories and make the best food, and I wanted to tell everyone that you're my grandmother, but Dad said I wasn't allowed to talk about it. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret felt her heart break and sore simultaneously break for the pain her grandson was experiencing, sore with pride that at least one member of this family still understood what really mattered. Daniel buried his face in his hands. Jesus, Mum, do you have any idea what this has done to us? What it's done to you? The words exploded out of Margaret with a force that surprised everyone, including herself. What about what you've done to me, Daniel? What about the 3 weeks I've spent wondering if I raised a stranger? What about the birthdays I won't be invited to? The Christmas dinners where I'm not welcome, the grandchildren who will grow up thinking their grandmother isn't good enough for their father's new life. She was standing now, all pretense of polite tea service abandoned. What about the 43 years your father and I spent sacrificing everything so you could have opportunities we never dreamed of? What about the love and support and unconditional acceptance that made you confident enough to succeed in the first place? Victoria tried to interrupt. Margaret, if you would just. No. Margaret's voice cut through the air like a blade. I'm done being managed, Victoria. I'm done being handled and dismissed and treated like some inconvenient relative who needs to be minimized for the sake of appearances. She walked to the bookshelf and pulled out a photo album, one of the many that chronicled Daniel's childhood. The albums she'd once hoped to share with her grandchildren before being told her stories were inappropriate. You want to know what's inappropriate? She said, flipping through pages of birthday parties and school plays and family holidays. This is inappropriate. A mother who loved her son so much she worked double shifts to pay for his tutoring. A father who sold his tools to buy law textbooks. Parents who attended every school event, every sports match, every milestone, cheering louder than anyone else because they were so damn proud of what their boy was achieving. She slammed the album shut and looked directly at Daniel, who was now openly crying. "That's what's inappropriate, Daniel. That's what you're embarrassed by. The evidence that you were loved unconditionally by people who weren't sophisticated enough to hide their feelings. Behind networking strategies and social climbing." Tommy stood up suddenly, his teenage frame tall and gangly, his voice shaking with emotion. "I want to come to your dinner parties, Nana. I want to hear the stories about Dad and Grandpa Peter. I want to know where I come from, even if Dad doesn't." Victoria rounded on him with fury. "Thomas, sit down. You don't understand. I understand perfectly." Tommy shot back, and there was so much of Peter in his voice that Margaret's heart stuttered. "I understand that Nana makes the best food in the world and tells the best stories and actually cares about people instead of just using them for networking." "Tommy," Daniel said weakly, but his son wasn't finished. "I saw the video, Dad. I saw how happy everyone was at Nana's party. I saw how much they loved being there. How much they loved her. When's the last time anyone at one of your parties looked that happy? When's the last time you looked that happy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw not the successful barrister he'd become, but the insecure little boy who'd always sought approval, who'd always been afraid of not being good enough, who'd apparently decided that the solution was to discard anyone who reminded him of a time when he wasn't perfect. "Daniel," she said quietly, "when did you become afraid of being loved?" The question broke him. Completely, utterly broke him. He doubled over in his chair, sobbing with the kind of raw anguish that comes from finally confronting a truth too painful to acknowledge. "I thought," he gasped between sobs, "I thought if I could just be successful enough, perfect enough, if I could just prove that we weren't." "That I wasn't." "Wasn't what?" Margaret asked gently, moving to sit beside him for the first time since he'd arrived. "Poor," he whispered. "Common. Working class. I thought if I could just erase where I came from, if I could just reinvent myself completely, then I'd finally be worthy of respect, of success, of love." Margaret finished softly. He nodded, still crying, and suddenly he was 8 years old again, sobbing because the other children at school had made fun of his hand-me-down uniform. Margaret did what she'd done then. She pulled him into her arms and held him while he fell apart. "You stupid, wonderful boy," she murmured into his hair, which still smelled faintly of the same shampoo she'd used when he was small. "You've always been worthy of love. You were worthy of it when you wore second-hand clothes and lived in a tiny house in Marrickville. You were worthy of it when you struggled with reading and needed extra help with mathematics. You were worthy of it every single day of your life. Not because of what you achieved, but because of who you are." Victoria watched this reunion with the expression of someone witnessing a car accident, horrified but unable to look away. Tommy, however, had moved closer, clearly wanting to be part of this family reconciliation but uncertain of his place in it. Margaret extended one arm toward him, and he fell into the embrace. With the desperate gratitude of a teenager who'd been drowning in adult complications and finally found solid ground. "I'm sorry," Daniel kept saying, the words tumbling out between sobs. "I'm so sorry, Mum. I don't know what happened to me. I don't know when I became someone who would treat you like that. I don't know when I forgot." "You forgot that you were already enough," Margaret said simply. "You forgot that the people who love you don't need you to be perfect. They just need you to be real." They sat like that for a long time, 3 generations of O'Connors holding on to each other. While Victoria watched from the sidelines, clearly calculating whether this emotional breakthrough was beneficial or detrimental to her long-term plans. Finally, Margaret pulled back and looked at her son with the clear, direct gaze that had once made recalcitrant students confess their misdeeds without being asked. "Now," she said, "what are we going to do about this mess you've created?" Daniel wiped his eyes, straightening slightly as his legal training kicked in. "I want to fix it, Mum. All of it. I want to make a public statement. I want to have you back in our lives. I want the kids to know their grandmother properly. I want." He looked around the room, taking in the evidence of the life he'd tried to distance himself from, the worn but well-loved furniture. The family photos, the books that had been read and reread, the flowers from a garden tended with care and patience. "I want to come home," he said simply. Victoria's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Daniel, be reasonable. Your career, my career will survive," he said, and there was something new in his voice, something that sounded suspiciously like backbone. "You know what might not survive? My relationship with my children if they grow up thinking success means abandoning the people who love you." He turned to Margaret with an expression of desperate hope. "Mum, the dinner parties. The community things you're doing. Could we be part of that? Not to manage it or control it or make it more sophisticated, but just to remember what family actually means?" Margaret looked at her son, his expensive suit wrinkled, his perfect composure shattered, his careful facade completely abandoned, and saw not the disappointment he'd become, but the possibility he could still be. She thought about the guests from Sunday's party, about the genuine connections and authentic joy, about the community she was building based on truth instead of networking. She thought about forgiveness, about second chances, about the difference between earning love and simply accepting it. "The dinner parties aren't going anywhere," she said finally. "They're becoming a regular thing. Monthly, at least. And yes, you can be part of them. All of you." but not as my son, the successful barrister gracing us with his presence. Just as Daniel. Just as Tommy's father and Sophie's daddy, and my child who makes mistakes sometimes but is working to do better." Tommy whooped with joy, launching himself at his grandmother with renewed enthusiasm. Even Daniel managed a watery smile, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him in months. Victoria, however, was not finished fighting. "This is ridiculous," she said, standing with the sharp efficiency of someone calling a meeting to order. "Daniel, you're being emotional and impractical. Your partnership." "Victoria." Daniel's voice was quiet but final. "Stop." She stared at him as if he'd suddenly started speaking in tongues. "I beg your pardon?" I said. "Stop." He stood up, and suddenly he was taller than Margaret remembered, more solid, more present. "Stop calculating. Stop managing. Stop treating my family like they're liabilities to be minimized. I'm trying to protect your career." "No," Daniel said, and his voice was getting stronger with each word. "You're trying to protect your image of what my career should look like. But you know what? I'd rather be a mediocre barrister with a real family than a successful one with a manufactured life." Victoria's perfectly composed facade finally cracked completely. "Are you insane? Do you have any idea what we've invested in building your reputation? What I've sacrificed to support your ambitions? What you've sacrificed?" Margaret stood up, and there was something in her posture that made Victoria take an involuntary step backward. "What about what Daniel sacrificed? What about the son who used to call me every Sunday just to chat? Who used to bring his children over to help in the garden? Who used to be proud of where he came from instead of ashamed of it?" She moved closer to Victoria, and despite the difference in their ages, it was clear who held the power in this moment. "You want to talk about investments?" Margaret continued, her voice deadly quiet. "I invested 43 years in raising a man with integrity, kindness, and genuine love for his family. You invested 3 years in trying to erase all of that so he'd be suitable for your social climbing ambitions." Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I never." "Yes," Margaret said simply. "You did. And now you need to decide, do you love Daniel enough to let him be himself? Or do you only love the version of him that makes you look good?" The silence that followed was profound. Tommy watched with wide eyes, clearly understanding that he was witnessing something momentous. Daniel stared at his wife with an expression that suggested he was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Victoria looked around the room at the family photos, at the evidence of genuine love and connection, at the faces. Watching her with a mixture of hope and judgment. Whatever she saw there made her straighten her spine and lift her chin with the pride of someone who had made her choice. "I need some air," she said finally, and walked out of the house without another word. Daniel started to follow her, old habits dying hard, but Margaret caught his arm. "Let her go," she said gently. Some bridges can be rebuilt, Daniel. Others need to be allowed to burn so you can see what's on the other side." He nodded, sinking back into his chair with the exhaustion of someone who had just fought a war and wasn't entirely sure who had won. "What happens now?" he asked. Margaret smiled, and it was the first completely unguarded smile she'd given her son in years. "Now we have tea. Real tea, with proper biscuits and stories that don't have to be appropriate for anyone except us. And then you help me plan next month's dinner party. Can I invite some people?" Tommy asked eagerly. "There's this kid at school whose grandparents are from Lebanon, and they make this amazing bread." "Of course you can," Margaret said, ruffling his hair with the casual affection she'd been afraid she'd lost forever. "The more the merrier." As the afternoon sun slanted through her living room windows, Margaret O'Connor sat with her son and grandson. Planning menus and making lists, rebuilding connections that had been strained nearly to breaking. Outside, Victoria paced in the garden, occasionally glancing through the windows at the family gathering she'd never been able to understand or appreciate. Margaret felt a moment of sympathy for her daughter-in-law it couldn't be easy to realize. You'd been fighting a battle that had already been lost. That love and authenticity would always triumph over image and ambition in the end. But the sympathy was brief. She had more important things to focus on: the son, who was finally coming home, the grandson who wanted to hear her stories, and the community she was building one dinner party at a time. The revolution that had started with a single phone call was complete. Margaret O'Connor had not only survived her family's rejection, she had transformed it into something magnificent. She had built a new life, found her voice, and in the process, reminded everyone around her what really mattered. Love, connection, authenticity, the courage to be yourself, especially when other people found that self inconvenient. The game had indeed changed, and Margaret had won more completely than she'd ever dared to imagine. The only question now was whether Victoria would choose to join the victory celebration or continue fighting a war that was already over. But that, Margaret realized as she listened to her son and grandson, planning their guest list with the enthusiasm of people who had rediscovered joy, was Victoria's choice to make. The door was always open. But it opened both ways. And for the first time in months, Margaret O'Connor was perfectly content with whatever choice her daughter-in-law made. She had her family back. Everything else was just details. The end. Your like and subscription mean more than you know. They help me keep creating and sharing heartfelt stories.